We're here in beautiful St. Faith Church. That'll be explained a little bit more with the Reverend Travis Enright.
Well, I'm the archdeacon for reconciliation and decolonization. And that role is designed to inhabit new spaces or reimagine old spaces or give the church a new way of engaging diverse set of people, right? You know, the queer people, the indigenous people, newcomers. So the church needs to figure out ways to open up and understand its own colonizing way, and then figuring out pathways that we can somehow find many entry points into finding health and finding wealth and hopefulness, and wealth not necessarily money, but wealth and love of God. But all those things so that people can find their best way of existing in this planet, you know, and in direct connection with their relations, like the ones who come before and the ones that will come after and the ones that are walking with us as neighbors, right? Saint Faith. Saint Faith. But the building is called Saint Faith. But the expression is slowly going to be called Lodgepole. Okay. So it's called Lodgepole Communitas. So it's many entry points in. It's a way of doing church in a post-colonial, in the midst of being reconciled. Right.
It's beautiful.
And it's about the Cree word is key now, us together. How do we become us together? Sure. I'm Travis. Originally, my family background name is Constant. So we were the Constants. If you go look at Treaty 6, we were the original treaty signers and negotiators in Fort Pitt and Fort Carleton. So we were the original families there. And Bernard Constant, who's my direct descendant, is one of the few people who actually signed his name to the treaty. All the previous people, they signed an X, which is nothing against that, but he signed his name. And he particularly had a role in installing education, on-reserve education in the treaty. The Treaty 5 didn't have that provision. They had some kind of weird language around education. But there's an acknowledgement that we need to be part of this conversation with settlers, people who are immigrating from many places. We are a country of immigrants. Needed to acknowledge that we had to figure out ways to learn from each other, how to be in unity with each other so that we can share each other's truth, share each other's spirituality, share each other's lodges, right? So Crees would tend to think of a spiritual home as a lodge, something that is built every season, but it also returns to the earth every season. But Europeans come to think of a place of a church, a formal structure. And then with the tragedy and the sinfulness, and I mean I use that word purposefully, of the Indian residential schools. So my ancestor had a dream of being together, being treating people together around education. But then in 1867, 1873, the bureaucratic component parts of that turned it into a system of assimilation. So the system of assimilation targeted the most vulnerable people in our community that are young, are very young. So they separated the young from grandparents. And if you know people from that, if you separate a child from his grandparents, everything loses purposefulness. Now, grandparent loses purposefulness, and then the child loses purpose. And so then that was the tragedy of it.
Yeah, and as I know of it, not only from families, but a culture, a language, a way of seeing the world. Like you were talking about the lodge and the rationale and beauty and the understanding of that, also lost, snuffed out.
Snuffed out. That's a good word, snuffed out, purposely snuffed out. Yeah. Well, I think the thing that the biggest word that was missing in truth in reconciliation is courage. And I think we're in a time of great opportunities to be courageous. And I think the church came in a very particular format as ethnic groupings from overseas. Again, these are immigrants that came in. There's a lot of conversation about immigration, but everybody's an immigrant, right? And so they came in as immigrants with a very particular way of doing church, around their particular language and around their particular way of doing ceremony. But on this land, right, we didn't have the same problems. In Europe, you could almost see each other's difference, and the idea of community is that you'd build a wall around your city, and you had one entry point in, and that was purposeful. You had one entry point in. And you could almost feel each other's fabric of clothes because the weaver you knew. So everything was really, really tight. And there's a beauty to that. But in Canada, on this land, you can have an enemy, right, who lives, 300 miles away. And, by time they walked here and you could see them on the landscape, right, you could see them coming because, Alberta is so flat.
Yeah.
Right. By time they leave their encampment, they leave it as an enemy. But the land would cause them to slow down, and it would rain, it would be mucky, and it would be sunny, and all of a sudden, as you move closer and closer, you tend to forget why you're enemies.
I love that.
And as soon as you move closer and closer, you become cousins.
Beautiful.
Right. So I think that's the idea. Yeah. It's not about trying to build walls. How many entry points in can we all have?
Yeah, the land is also the instructor.
The land
is a cause of healing and reconciliation.
That's right. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Why I love the medicine wheel and the four directions and the four natures of Cree teachings, particularly around the Creator. There's movement in that, right? And there's also difference in it because it talks about the many peoples who come to this land, who share this land. But the component part, what we're celebrating, is the reclaiming of spirituality in this moment. Bernadette Ayatollah said, "I'm so tired of yelling, and so tired of crying and so tired of being beaten. At some point in time, we have to claim that the spirituality of the medicine wheel. And I think that is what the courage is also about. How do we claim that spirituality in a good way?
Yeah.
Right? It's not about saying, can we all be the same?
Right.
Or do we have ancestral home, which is beautiful? But how do we find and be willing to hear another person's truth, right? And allow that dignity of difference, that dignity of their own creative story from a different direction to come in and be revelatory on my truth.
Yeah.
Right. That's the nature of the lodge. Everybody coming together, sharing their story, sharing how they came to this land, sharing how they find wonderment in being formed by this land. Right. This land is again is a permanent dialogue partner.
Yeah.
Right? Simple, showing up.
Showing up.
And I think holding your story, as delicate and beautiful as it is, but there's a thing that we do called healing of memories. And I think if there's a mechanism that the ministries of St. Faith use, is kind of this concept of healing of memories. Everybody has a story, right? And everybody has trauma, right? It is in the vulnerability of sharing that trauma and having every story needs a listener. And I think that's the biggest part of this particular moment of courage and storytelling and showing up is be willing to hear another person's story as they tell it. Don't edit it and don't justify colonial behavior or whatever. Just hear the story, but hear from your, like you said, from your own vulnerability, from your own trauma. And then you'll find different connecting points. There is we have a CRC pastor as part of our communitas here, and she tells a story often when she first arrived here. She didn't know what to do. She felt overwhelmed by the number of, because we have a large street ministry, because we're on 118th Avenue and it's beautiful. So people would come in, maybe a bit intoxicated, maybe a bit this or maybe a bit that, and she felt her own privilege in that. So she's feeling pretty vulnerable, and her own mental health was not the best on that day. And then she saw this man coming in. He looked equally that he was not having the best day, right? And his hands were down, and she said, I just want to sit with him. I don't know what God was saying to there. I just want to sit with him. So she sat down, and he put his head up. And they looked at each other's eyes, and all she said was, I also struggle with my own mental health. I also struggle with not knowing if I'm always in the right place, and I always feel I'm out of sorts. And then he told his story, and to this day, there's a connection that they had, and it's about showing up and being vulnerable. I think that is what the ministries of the St. Faith is, and we have a fund called Pakanosuin, which is out of Kings.
Yeah.
And that fund is a place where small bits of money can be given to people who need to tell their story, who need moments of healing in the memories, moments where they need to be reconnected. Sometimes on the street, no one's holding their story.
Yeah, to be seen, to be heard.
Yeah.
I've heard that being seen and heard like that is the closest definition to love. That the two and one are the same.
That's right. Yeah.
And when you talk about showing up, I think about our traditional Christian theology of incarnational theology. Ours is a God that showed up for us.
Oh.
And as you were talking about these stories,
not just for us, like it wasn't like Christology is lovely, but he showed up for, he named them.
Yeah.
Woman at the well.
Yes.
Martha.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he named people. It was doubly incarnate.
Yeah.
He showed up for people.
Right.
Right.
And saw right into
To
them.
them, you know.
It's
So
beautiful.
yeah.